Tov. All right. All right. I forgot about that. Let's put this here, get my stuff ready here. All right, ladies and gentlemen. It is wonderful to be back teaching again. Um, I I find that I've told some of you, I'm sure, over the years, part of the joy for me of teaching is not the actual teaching, it's all the preparation that comes beforehand. And the part of the reason is I also learn new things along the way, and I sometimes say, "Oh, I thought it was this," and it turns out to be that. And so it's an eye opener on occasion. And specifically tonight, there are a couple of things that when I was doing my research, I was unaware of. I knew very much about the last topic we were doing is Rabbi Jacob Joseph, the first and last chief rabbi in New York, but did not know that there were some others who tried to worm their way in around the same time or after. Very, very quick, short-lived. By the way, it's short-lived, not short-lived. Why? That's another story. Okay, so after this whole fiasco with Rabbi Jacob Joseph, there are some other rabbis who said, look, maybe he couldn't do it, but we can do it. And they declared themselves chief rabbi. Imagine I walk down to the park here in Mitzbenevo, and I declare myself chief rabbi of Shandalovia. You know, okay, great. All my subject, a community of me. But they declared themselves chief rabbis. There was one a Rav Vidorovich, who arrived and announced himself as chief rabbi of, get this, the United States and Canada. I guess illusions of grandeur. And this is, sorry, Rabbi Jacob Joseph is still alive at this point. And he comes on the heels of this decline of Rabbi Joseph, and it even undermines his authority even more. Why? Let's assume for a moment there are still people who respected him, who wanted him as chief rabbi. Now you come this guy who comes along, I'm chief rabbi of the United States and Canada. Like, okay, the title doesn't mean very much at that point. So it diminishes Rabbi Jacob Joseph in the eyes of the people. So the title itself, of course, basically becomes meaningless. There was another American dynamic, let's say, that religious authority could be claimed by anyone who could gather followers. Someone asked me an amazing question on Shabbat. What is the samchut, or the authority, of a rabbi who tells you to do something? So I said, so I have to define what we're talking about here, and I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase. If Rabbi X in Yerushalayim says that we can't do such and such a thing on Shabbat, does that mean I have to listen to him? The answer is no, because unless I have accepted his authority and he's my Rav, I mean, if it was someone like Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zatzal, but we don't have anyone like that now, who was called Rabban Shel Kol Yisrael, the Rav, basically everyone accepted him, that's one thing. But when it's one Rav, no matter how helped the latter he might be, doesn't necessarily mean that I have to follow his rulings. Because the concept of Asay L'Charav, you make for yourself a rabbi, and you follow what he tells you, unless he's wrong and makes mistakes, which case you should question. So the authority, again, I could move into a city. I can go to, I don't know, go to Haifa, set myself up in a neighborhood, and people, I start teaching and start working. People don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. You can worry. It's okay. I don't care. I'm not going anywhere. And after a little while, I say, you know what? This is cool. I decided that in this neighborhood of Haifa, I am the rabbi. I'm the chief rabbi of Haifa. Now, or the chief rabbi of the neighborhood. God forbid. So if I have followers and people who follow what I'm doing, then their response to me, or their fealty, for lack of a better term, becomes something that's a thing, as they say. But if I walk into Tel Aviv and say, I am now officially the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, it's meaningless. Okay, even though I could declare that, it's first of all, they have a chief rabbi, but it's just absolutely meaningless. So again, at the end, now we're going to kind of finish up the story with Rabbi Jacob Joseph. In 1895, he suffered a stroke. It left him partially paralyzed and bedridden. And during his last and final years, he was in poverty, or impoverished, and isolated. This rabbi, who was relatively famous at the time, and I know some of you knew the name because of the school named after him, RJJ, but didn't necessarily know who he was, and just by proves that he dies at the age of 59 in 1902, and it wasn't very. He didn't leave his mark. It was almost forgotten. Despite the difficulties of life in America, his death actually drew massive attention, and the funeral was attended by tens of thousands of Jews. But unfortunately, and we see this repeating itself literally today, that large enough gathering of Jews in any one place draws anti-Semitic hatred. Workers in a nearby factory decided it would be very cute to start throwing nuts and bolts at mourners and began a riot, injuring many. And the police had to come, they had to intervene. And the tensions between the Jewish immigrant community and the surrounding society kind of exploded as a result of that. How long that lasted, I couldn't tell you, but it definitely made things very difficult for a period of time for the Jews in the area. I don't want to leave with the impression that Rabbi Joseph was a failure, because despite his failure, let's say, as having an office of the chief rabbi that didn't stay in, and he ended up closing up shop, so to speak, he did leave some very important legacies that, as time went on, became part of what we expect in Jewish communal life. Kashrut reforms is probably the number one, which was the biggest challenge he had, and the biggest fights he had is kashrut reform, both in shechita and in kosher products. But he did set into motion, a systematic form of supervision of shachtim, a supervision of slaughterhouses, seals on meat, and this influenced later communities in America to take on these kashrut systems. There's also something he did that planted a seed that exploded, and that is yeshiva education. Yeshiva education, he helped develop what was known as the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, which eventually comes RIETS, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary, Rabbinical School of Yeshiva University. So if you want to go back, YU, which is the standard in the United States as far as rabbinical school, and they've ordained tens of thousands, probably thousands and thousands of people over the years. Its root is actually with Rabbi Jacob Joseph. He also published his sermons in the sefer called Levet Yaakov, and as I mentioned, and as you know, there's a very large New York yeshiva known as RJJ, Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, named in his honor. He also left some historical significance behind. I guess you could say the negative historical significance. There never was again an attempt to establish a national chief rabbinate. Most Orthodox community, I'm not talking right now in the Orthodox world, most Orthodox communities in the United States have in place various forms of communal life, a Beit Din, kashrut organization, Chevra Kadisha, Gamach, Daughters of Israel, whatever it's called. Some call it the Women's Leagues, the Daughters of Israel, all kinds of names for that, with mikvaot, yeshivot. So there's a framework, but really a lot of that comes back to the early days of Rabbi Jacob Joseph. But there was no, again, attempt to establish a chief rabbinate within the United States. Instead, American Orthodoxy kind of develops its own model. Remember, if RJJ was an experiment that unfortunately did not work out, something had to happen. Otherwise, the community would implode. And remember, these people, many of them, if not all of them, depending already how many years later, have at least an historical memory or an actual memory of what they had back in Europe or in Russia, where they did have some communal organizational life. So eventually, Orthodoxy develops this kind of model. There's voluntary rabbinic organizations. I'm going to come back and talk about that in a few minutes. Independent kashrut organizations. What's it mean, independent kashrut organization? There are some private ones where Rabbi so-and-so says, I'm going to give my hechsher, I'm going to have the whatever, I'm going to have the oval K. I just made that one up. There may be one like that. And I'm having my name attached to it. And I'm going to say, check the factories, I'm checking the restaurants, I'm checking the schools, whatever it might be. And I give my stamp of approval. He has every right to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly okay. Question is, you have to know who he is. You have to know his samchut, his authority. People have to know, is he reliable? but a kashrus agency answers to itself and its community, not to the people to whom they provide a service. Classic example, one of the classic differences, I mean, I don't get into it tonight, but one of the classic differences between kashrut in the United States and kashrut in Israel, which is extremely messed up here, is the who pays mashgiach. Depending on this business, if it is a meat restaurant, you have either a mashgiach who's working in the restaurant. If it's like a bakery, maybe a mashgiach goes in once or twice a day. But generally speaking, when the salary is paid to the mashgiach, in not every single case, for here in Israel, by the restaurant or by the bakery, but again, I want to say it's not by everybody. So what that leads, unfortunately, to possibilities of saying, what do you mean this ingredient is fine? Just you go say your daf yomi, and I'm going to continue using this ingredient, versus a kashrut agency in the States, which the mashgichim are paid by the kashrut agency and not by the bakery or the whatever the restaurant, whatever it might be. So it's why it's called an independent kashrut organization. It also gave birth at that time period, early days, to networks of yeshivot and different institutions. The Jewish American experience or environment at that time showed, because it was voluntary, it was pluralistic, it was decentralized, that it could not support a European style rabbinic hierarchy. There is a form of hierarchy by default. When I was a rabbi in the shul there and I said something, if there was a person of a higher authority in the city or within the country who said something differently, and then of course I respected, and I would I'd have to change my opinion, or I have to look into it. No, there's not an official hierarchy like the Havdalah in the church, where there was definitely hierarchy. In America, I'm just talking about the United States right now for our purpose of our discussion. The European style rabbinic hierarchy did not and does not exist in the United States. In spite of the fact that it was a personal tragedy for Rabbi Joseph, it turned out to be a real turning point in Jewish religious structure in the United States. Now, I want to show you something. Let's see if I can get this on the screen. Wait, let me just make this small for 1 second. Bear with me for a moment. I need this picture and this picture and this one. No. Oh, seriously? Oh, come on. Hold on. There's this one. Oh, here it is. Okay, and this one. Okay. I want to show you something which I personally am very proud. Share screen. Some of you know that my father, Shalom, was kashrus administrator for Chicago Rabbinical Council. When he took over the position in 1981, at that time it was considered a part-time position, and they had an operating budget of under $1 million. It's a multi-million-dollar budget, more than a full-time position over the years. And my father founded something. Let me show you what that was. He said that there are kashrus organizations around the United States, many, some very, very, very large, like the OU, the Chaf K, and the many, and there's some local regional ones. And it would be a really good idea for them to talk to each other and to come up with standards. I'll give you one example. I'm making this one up, doesn't mean it exists, that the idea of bishul akum, whether when a non-Jew was cooking something, how to make sure it's not that somehow a Jew is involved, that they would have a standard across all the organizations, that this is what's considered no longer bishul akum, whatever it might be. So he started an organization called ACO, which stood for the Association of Kashrus Organizations. This is the first meeting. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people here. Some of the names you may know. Rabbi Shimon Eider, you may know him, his halachic works. Rabbi Bernstein happened to have actually been one of my rabbis in yeshiva. My father in the middle, the only one without the black hat and no beard. That was very much my dad. Rabbi Heinemann, you may know the name. So this was the very, very first meeting. This is multiple organizations. So I think this represented 4 or 5 organizations. That was the first meeting. Now, I'll show you the other picture. Stop share. I go back to here, share this one. It has become this one, and also they had a 1 day conference. It is now, this is already years ago, it's a smaller group. It becomes it's a multi-day conference of kashrus organizations from, I don't know if it's around the world or within just the United States or Northern America. I just don't remember. And it's multi-day conference instead of a half-day meeting or a day meeting, where they have speakers and then people fly in, and it's a very, very big deal. And my dad founded this. For like I say, which I'm very proud of him. And I've heard speeches over the years from different people because of in various locations what it had to do with kashrus and all. And his name comes up, and he really made a very big difference. Baruch Hashem. When every level in our community in Chicago, Aguda, Mizrahi, and everything in between, the Tells community, everyone trusted the Chicago Rabbinical Council. Unfortunately, we can't say that about every kashrus organization. Everyone has problems. It's the nature of the beast. But and it's become much more than just a kashrus organization. If you read the Torah tidbits, you'll see OU beyond kashrut. Right? They always have something. So the same thing is true with CRC. They do a lot. But the reason I'm showing this to you is to show you where this come from, where our Rabbi Jacob Joseph started something that was not necessarily successful, but he planted a seed. And that seed is actually what ended up with my dad involved in this organization, which then was taken over and then exploded to a massive organization of kashrus organizations. And they have bylaws, and it's just not a bunch of black hats sitting around the table talking about how to make sure soda. It's pop, it's not soda. Becomes kosher. So that's. I'm kind of closing the door right now on the topic of RJJ and topic of that. We're going to move a little bit into, so we're going to stay within tonight's class, possibly next week. We're going to finish up the time period of the early 20th century and Jews coming to America up until about the 40s. And like I told you, we're going to go backwards then into the early 1900s, talking about World War I in general, and then World War I with the Jews. So what else is really happening at the same time is a cultural explosion in many ways. Number one, Yiddish America. There was a diminution early in the 1900s, in the early 20th century, in religious observance, which we talked about. At the same time, culture was beginning to grow. Now, this may sound familiar to you because we talked about this when we talked about the Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and whenever there's this drop in religious observance, it seems to be, or a rise in culture that becomes de rigueur, that's what you're going to do. The diminution of the religious observance seems to also go hand in hand with that. But there's one of the main Yiddish newspapers, the Forfeits or the Forward, the Jewish Forward, reached hundreds of thousands of people and was read voraciously by many people. Jewish theater, Yiddish theater thrived. Literature, poetry, humor, political debate, creativity, all began to explode. It's not just that the Jews were allowed to survive as opposed to living under a world of pogroms, but they're allowed to speak their own voice. This is something new, the entire generation, because all the people now who've come to the United States, whether they came as 8 years old or they came in their 40s or 50s, which by that point may be considered old, they only knew a world, for the most part, not everybody, but knew a world where their hands were tied, their mouths were tied shut because of the lack of ability and permission to speak their mind. What else happens, though, of course, as we've seen in many, many other classes, and you're also well aware of, is anti-Semitism starts to grow in the United States in a very different way than it is today. It's much more subtle and not Mamdani type of anti-Semitism. America is not free from anti-Semitism. You think, oh, the Golden Medina, the Gold Land, and the Jews have freedom. Yeah, as they say in Chinese, "Anechtigen Tag." It's a Yiddish expression, but literally means yesterday's day. But it means, yeah, right, give me a break. So what do they face? Again, this is going to sound anything different than it did prior to World War II. They faced social exclusion, discrimination in housing, university quotas. Henry Ford, published anti-Semitic booklets about the Jews. Elite groups barred Jews from joining. In Chicago, there's a neighborhood not far from where I used to live called Sauganash. It's an exclusive neighborhood. Until not that many years ago, there was an actual contract when you would sell a house in Sauganash that when you sold your house, you were not allowed to sell to a Jew or a black. And that was not that, I'm not talking 5 years ago that it was repealed, but let's say if it was 20 years ago, still modern times. But compared to Eastern Europe or Russia, the anti-Semitism was informal. It wasn't obviously state mandated. Jews could respond. There was organizational life. There was advocacy. There was some success. There were protests. So they weren't experiencing, quote, pogroms, but they were definitely experiencing this undercurrent of exclusion and anti-Semitism. Now, what I'll mention now will sound familiar to some of you who raised your children here. Or came on Aliyah with young kids. And that's a generational divide between parents and children. Children Americanized very quickly. They spoke English. They dressed differently than they may have in the shtetl. Parents were often left behind, both socially and especially when it came to language. It created, on one hand, pain for the parent, and on the other hand, pride. They were proud of their children growing, becoming acculturated and growing into America. Conflict. Sometimes children would rise socially, but at the expense of tradition. They would give things up, which we've spoken about already. And you'll find here, they say that in Israel, that Hebrew is the only language in the world that parents learn the mother tongue from their children. And I found that to be very true for many families. Just as a side comment, kind of a pet peeve of mine, Ingvar, we're talking about it. I talked to lots of people, and I've heard tremendous amount of interest last trip recently to Chicago of Aliyah. I talked to lots of people in general about Aliyah from many different cities. And one of the things I always stress is even if you're thinking about it, it's as they say in the Gemara, havamina, that you're going to come on Aliyah, work on Hebrew right away. A person can, depending where they live, get along in English. But what you're doing is exactly what they did in the early days of America when they came from Europe and they didn't want to learn English. They just stayed with their little Yiddish world and their little Yiddish communities and little Yiddish culture and didn't want to break out. So you build walls. The same thing is true I found over and over again in Israel. And I hear an expression from people who come on Aliyah. They talk about the Israelis. I hate to break the news to you, but if you made Aliyah, you're Israeli as well. You're just not Israeli born. Your neshama was born here, but you weren't born here. That's fine. But you're Israeli as well. You need to learn the language. It's important. No one's going to tell you to be fluent. You can make 1,000 mistakes, but you got to try. And one of the things I've told many students over the years, like my teenage students, is you can learn a lot of great things from your parents. Don't learn the fact that they don't want to learn Hebrew. You may be language challenged, and there is such a thing. That's fine. Get some basics. It will ingratiate you more into a community, into a store, into whatever it might be. The reason I'm mentioning is because it's exactly what we're talking about here in America, in Jewish history and the history of Jews coming to America, because they faced the exact same thing, where the parent would ask the child to write something for them, whether it was a message to an employer or to school that the child had to write, and the parent would have to sign. If you understand the reference, signed Epstein's mother. So it is a fact that you have to understand and be involved using the language. It's very important. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox. What else happened was in the United States at this time were what became known as immigration quotas. In 1924, the United States passed a law very strictly restricting immigration. And the gates then eventually closed, and millions who might have escaped Europe, unfortunately, as we know, were unable to. It was at a tremendous historical cost, where the Jewish community in America was starting to stabilize, but at the cost of many of their fellow Jews not being able to make it to the United States to be in a safe location. These quotas become tremendous disaster, of course, and before World War II and during World War II, which when we get to that topic, we will also discuss. And now, in some ways, this pendulum swung the 180 degrees because until a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, open borders was the policy, and closing the borders seems to be more the policy now. And many countries in Europe right now are dealing with the fallout of open border policy. You can't, I don't think you can look at the news any day of the week and not see a story of an immigrant, unfortunately, who's done something wrong in these various countries. I'm not saying that the Jews would have come in and done bad things. I'm just talking the whole concept of immigration and quotas and borders that are open and porous and borders that are closed is nothing new. It's going back even before this time period of Jewish history in 1924 or history, but here becomes official United States. What I want to talk about for the rest of the time tonight is Jewish institutional America. And I think that's important because there'll be some it's like alphabet soup, some letters. You talk about in the United States, there's the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, and on and on and on. And maybe in general what they are. Jewish life had and still has many of these alphabet organizations whose either primary or secondary purpose was to aid the Jews in different things, which we'll see, and which are, if I'm not mistaken, every organization I'll talk about is still in business, and I mean that in quotes because it's not a business, are still around and active. The first one I will talk about is what was called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or just known as the Joint. I'm not talking about something you smoke. I'm not talking about a hangout. It's just known as the Joint. I actually tried to get a job with them before we made Aliyah. Obviously, I didn't get one. But what they started in 1914, because again, we're backing up a little bit. At the outbreak of World War I, they became started as an emergency response organization to coordinate American Jewish philanthropy for Jews who were suffering overseas, mostly Eastern Europe and Ottoman Palestine. Palestine, i.e. Israel, at that time was still called, before May of 48, was still called Palestine. The only one that ever will be like that. I'm doing a lot of politics tonight, sorry. And they were there because they were having problems. So the funds needed to be channeled to these communities, and the joint distribution, for the word to distribute, okay, sometimes just listen to the name of the organization, you'll understand their mahut or their essence. So the JDC or the joint, that was their original mandate. That early 1900s was indirectly aiding immigrants. It played a very critical role in the immigration story, because eventually they also are going to provide the immigrants with food, medical care, shelter for Jews in war-torn Europe. I'm talking about. They funded schools, orphanages, vocational training, emigration efforts, trying to help them get out for where they were to get to the United States and help Jews survive long enough to emigrate to the United States. Remember, emigrate means to go out from somewhere, and immigrate means to come, like immigrate. Technically, the word should be in English, immigration, I-N-M-I-G. But because you can't say in, that's so historically the word became immigration. So in effect, the joint, or the JDC, made immigration into the United States possible by stabilizing the Jews in Europe before they came to the United States. Now, we saw that there were many Jews that came in Behala. There was a bit of confusion, what was going on, and didn't know anything. But at the same time, there were some Jews already who were the beneficiaries of the work of the joint, and they had some form of stabilized life, finances, vocational training, whatever, as before I mentioned, when they came over. The actual impact of what they did, they helped 110,000 Jews emigrate from Nazi Germany in the 30s. They also were able to help and sustain hundreds of thousands of Jews during World War I and after. And they worked closely with HIAS, which we're going to talk about in a moment, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, to help the migration of Jews from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, to the United States. Their significance, which is to this very day, it represents literally a global arm of American Jewish responsibility. One thing, and we saw this when we were talking about Ellis Island, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it tonight, actually. One thing that we have to say about our Jews, no matter where you are in the spectrum, uber religious or not religious at all, we take care of our own. And we have seen it time and time and time again. And it's who we are. It says that the Jews are noted by three things: Rachmanim, Baishanim, Gomlei Chasadim. Rachmanim, we have Rachmanis, we have mercy on each other. Baishanim literally means we're embarrassed, but means we have a sense of tzniut and honor among each other. And Gomlei Chasadim, Gemilut Chesed, right? Doing acts of kindness. That's what who a Jew is. And by doing that, these kind of societies, like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which I'll come to in a sec, the JDC, all these, that's who we are. We take care of our own. So let's talk about Hayas. Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which still exists. It's founded in 1881, which is earlier by about 20-something years than the Joint. It emerged mostly as a response to the mass migration of Jews leaving the pogroms of Russia, the Russian Empire. Probably the most important organization for Jewish immigrants entering the United States. Their main activities, or core activities, were to help the Jew, as the name says, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. I want to read a paragraph too, because something occurred to me as I was preparing for tonight. I said, we talked about Ellis Island 1,000 times, never mentioned why it's called Ellis Island. So I'm going to read you a paragraph that I found. I didn't know this. Ellis Island is named after Samuel Ellis, a colonial New Yorker and merchant who owned the property in the 1770s. Before it was known as Ellis Island, the land was previously referred to by European settlers as Little Oyster Island or Oyster Island. Samuel Ellis purchased the small tidal island around 1774. He established a tavern and a small business on the site. The island naturally took on his name over time, hence Ellis Island. Why am I mentioning that again now? Because Hayas, as I mentioned just as an aside when we were talking about Ellis Island, and I said, we'll get back to it. Now we're getting back to it. They established a bureau at Ellis Island in 1904 because if their job, their self-appointed job, is helping Jewish immigrants, where's your better place than maybe Louisiana, which we didn't talk about at all, but is in New York at Ellis Island. So in 1904, they set up shop in Ellis Island. They provided translation services, and I'm not mean this is a joke. There's no Google Translate. There's no internet. There's no communication like that. We can't think in those terms. You have to talk about it's the beginning, very, very beginning of the 20th century. They also helped guide the immigrants through their medical exams or medical inspections, again, which we spoke about. They fought against any deportation cases. They were an advocate for their fellow Jews. Made sure they had any legal entry requirements. You had to prove certain documents, certain paperwork. You don't just literally walk up the boat and say, hey, here I am. And they also helped to locate relatives and spouses in order to become an immigrant or to be allowed into the country, and you wouldn't become a burden on society. One of the things we talked about, you had to have a sponsor or relative. Sponsor meant that you would sign off that you would be, I don't know the length of time, let's say a year, that you're willing to have legal responsibility for this person for supporting them for a year. When, what year was it? Don't remember the exact year, but around, I was already married. Oh no, many years, right? So let's say the mid 80s. I had an aunt and uncle in Russia, a great aunt and uncle, my dad's uncle and aunt. They wanted to come to the United States, not for a visit, but to stay. Oh no, sorry, my dad's first cousin and his wife and kids. And they wanted to come to the United States to move, to live. And still, it wasn't a great time for Jews. And my parents, it's the first time I ever heard the expression, they had to sponsor my cousin, my cousin, to move to the United States. Of course, he moves to the United States, becomes famously wealthy, Baruch Hashem. But that's what they had to do. Otherwise, the reason, and you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Why would I want someone to come to my country, United States? I'm talking from the perspective of the United States, and become a burden on society. Now I have to have the food stamps, and I have to have the public shelters, and I have to have all this stuff. I have enough of my own sorrows. Why do I have to bring more in? So they had to have people who would sponsor them or have relatives. As long as they had relatives, the belief was at least that they would take care of their own. So Hayas also was able to open up soup kitchens, clothing distribution, loans. They would provide loans, employment, housing, reunited families that were separated. They helped approximately 100,000 Jewish immigrants entering the United States in the early years of their work. They also played a very large role in a good percentage of American Jews in general. And they were really the front line. They're the front line of the immigration story of the Jewish immigration. And they turned what was, and again, this is a repeat because I said we're going to come back to it, we turned into what was a chaotic, traumatic arrival in the United States. This order and dignity, legal. Let's go back. For those of you who came on Aliyah way before Nefesh B'Nefesh, you can tell one story after another of your early experiences, whether it was in the Merkaz Klita or just getting literally off the boat or the airplane and not knowing what you had to do, where you had to go, and having to stay all day in one misrad and finding out you brought the wrong papers, and then having to run around and all, to basically stepping off the airplane as we did with Nefesh B'Nefesh. You already had your Teudat Zehut number and you landed. You were Israeli when you landed. Very different experience. So that's I mean, when someone writes the Jewish history of this time period of history and look back, let's say 50 years, 100 years from now, Nefesh B'Nefesh is going to play whatever your positive, negative, any organization has both. They have massively helped the entire Aliyah process, and for some, the post-Aliyah process. Another organization, the UOJCA. Now, some of you may or may not know what that stands for. Most of you know that as the OU. We grew up in the Midwest calling it the UO. The rest of the world called it the OU, which was what? Why was it called the OU or the UO? What did it mean? So originally it was called the UOJCA. Again, that's what we all knew it as kids. The Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. It's founded in 1898. The OU was made, its goal was to unify Orthodox shuls in America. It was not founded as a kashrus organization. It wasn't founded as a speakers bureau. It wasn't founded as an aid society. It was specifically to unify Orthodox synagogues in America. Hence the name Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. Obviously, as we'll see, their essence over time changed. But what was it like in the early 20th century? I'll tell you a funny story. When I was growing up, since my dad was the camp director, Camp Mosheva Wild Rose, so I grew up in camp as a little kid. And before camp would start, the regular camp, they would have a program from the OU through NCSY, National Council of Synagogue Youth. And it was generally back then was mostly non-religious children. The goal was to bring them for a weekend, for a few days and experience Shabbat. So I had a kippah they had given out to the kids. It said NCSY on the side. I must have been, I don't remember where the story took place, but I was back in Chicago. And I was wearing the kippah. I was a kid. And someone asked me, why does your kippah say nosy? I said, what do you mean? So it says nosy, which is not how you spell the name. N-O-S-Y. So it says N-C-S-Y. But just jumping into today, the OU has become a massive organization around the world. Again, not just in kashrut. But I don't want to jump ahead. Let's go back to the early 20th century. Again, it was not an immigration society. That was Hayas. That was the Joint. That was their role. They played a role, though, in absorbing immigrants religiously and socially. That's where their forte was. They helped immigrants maintain religious identity in this brand new environment. They did help, this is important note for what's coming up, to establish kashrut supervision systems that allow Jews to keep kosher in America. This is the early glimmer. First, it is the Rabbi Jacob Joseph part, and then they will take this and run with it eventually as to this massive kashrut organization, I believe the largest one in the world. They are. And they strengthen synagogue life. If you think about today, the idea of the young Israel, like Young Israel of Century City, Young Israel of Staten Island, Young Israel, whatever it might be, that's a whole reshet of shuls, and you have Young Israel of in Ginot Shomron. There's also there, but all over. Years ago, someone said we should start one in Ma'ale Adumim. I said no, and they wanted me to do it. No, thank you. But the purpose of having this whole reshet of this whole network of shuls under the aegis of Young Israel again, was to give the support that you had the support and similar standards within all the shuls. Again, that's changed over time. But going back to the early 20th century, the goal was to strengthen the synagogue life and advocate for religious rights in American society. They were actually what we would call today a PAC, a political action committee. They weren't an actual PAC, but they did serve a function like that when there would be legislation that would be problematic for Orthodox Jews. Most immigrants arrived from Eastern Europe with very strong religious backgrounds. Not everyone was with payas and beards down to their knees, and the women covering their hair with a mitpachad and a hat. That's not the way it is. But many, if not most, came from some form of religious background from the shtetl and from Europe. But when they came to the States, they faced the problems we talked about: assimilation, the lack of kosher certification, very weak communal organizations, and the OU helped to transform America into a place where Orthodoxy could not only survive, just being Jewish and religious, not just physically, but institutionally, because it's very important, the institutional aspect as well. And I would say that the OU probably, with their help, led to the fact that religious life did not collapse in the United States, but did actually do the opposite, help to rebuild Torah in the life of America, in America, which leads to the last topic, or the next organization, which I'm going to move to next week already, and that some of you are aware of, is called Torah Umesorah. Also, still to this day, a very active organization, which was founded in 1944 by Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich. Again, incredible story, incredible individual, and what the organization has done for Torah in the United States. Also really important to know that, but we're going to push that up Bezrat Hashem until next week. And in the meantime, wish everyone a good evening, and we shall talk.
When did the
Thank you very
ADL
much.
start?